Old man tied 3 helpless 9 German Shepherd puppies to a tree. Then soldier did something unthinkable. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Under the blistering sun of the Arizona desert outskirts, where the earth cracked open in thirst and not a single tree offered shade, 3 tiny German Shepherd puppies were tied tightly to the trunk of a dead tree. A grizzled old man had done it without a second glance, walking away as if discarding garbage. No water, no food, no shelter. Just the heat, the silence, and the slow creeping shadow of death. They were no more than 6 weeks old, too young to understand life, but just old enough to sense that it was slipping away. One was dark-coated, one rust-colored, and the third had a patch of white across its chest, like a crescent moon. Their bodies trembled, their tongues lolled from dehydration, and their eyes, wide and confused, searched for something they would never find. Their mother? Cars passed, people stared. Some snapped photos through their windows, then drove away. 4 hours passed since the old man left. 4 hours that felt like an eternity when you're tied to a dying tree with the sun eating away your last breath. In the distance, a dusty silver pickup slowed and came to a stop. The man behind the wheel was Caleb Stone, a former Special Forces operative, home after 15 years of war zones and loss. His heart bore scars no one could see, and his eyes had the look of someone who'd forgotten what it meant to feel whole. He had no family left, no mission, only the hollow echo of a name that no longer fit the man he'd become. He didn't know why he turned down the old dirt path. Maybe it was muscle memory from days on patrol. Maybe it was instinct. Whatever it was, it led him straight to them. He saw the puppies before he heard them. 3 tiny shapes curled against a sun-baked trunk. Caleb stopped, breath caught in his throat. He stepped out of the truck, the hot gravel crunching beneath his boots. The scent of burned earth and fear hit him like a memory. He knelt down slowly, as if approaching a landmine. The black puppy whimpered, its body shuddering. The rust-colored one lay limp, and the one with the white patch was almost still, barely breathing. "Oh God," Caleb whispered. He reached for the knife strapped to his belt and carefully cut through the fraying ropes. One by one he cradled them in his arms, fragile and weightless. He grabbed his canteen and let water drip gently into his hand, holding it to their dry mouths. They drank like they hadn't in days. "You're gonna be all right," he said, more to himself than to them. "You're with me now." He didn't have a plan. Just like in combat, there was no time to think. There was only action. Caleb wrapped the puppies in an old towel from his truck, placed them gently in the back seat, and headed home. To the one place he had left, his late mother's house, untouched since her passing. Inside the dusty garage, he fashioned a makeshift bed from old blankets. He cleaned them, fed them what little dog food he could find, and watched as tiny sparks of life returned. The dark puppy stared up at him with eyes far too knowing for his age. The rust one leaned against his leg as if it had always belonged there. And the smallest, with the white chest, lay curled in a ball in his lap, shivering but safe. That night, Caleb didn't sleep. He sat on the garage floor, back against the wall, watching over them like a sentry in the field. In the stillness, as the desert cooled and the wind whispered through the cracked window, he realized something had shifted. For the first time in months, the ache in his chest had quieted. These weren't just puppies. They were purpose, and none of them knew it yet. But their story had only just begun. Warmth from the past beneath the rustling silence of the Arroyo Valley, where desert winds whispered like ghosts through brittle sagebrush. The old wooden cabin stood unchanged, weathered, lonely, and filled with the breath of memory. Caleb Stone pushed open the creaking door. Dust swirled in the fading light as he stepped into the space that once belonged to his father, Wallace, a quiet legend in the world of 9 training. Caleb wasn't there to grieve. Not really. Not really. He had come to say goodbye. But fate had other plans. He gently laid the 3 trembling puppies onto an old frayed blanket, one his father used to train his dogs years ago. It still smelled faintly of cedar, sweat, and time. Luna, the smallest pup with the crescent-shaped white patch on her chest, let out a weak whimper. Rusty lay still, barely breathing. The black-coated one, the one Caleb had started calling Shadow, stared back at him with eyes far too aware for a creature so young. Not scared, not panicked, watching. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. He moved quietly, mixing a bit of sugar and water, and spooned small drops into their mouths. The army had trained him to handle enemy fire, extract wounded men from burning buildings, survive in the harshest deserts. But not this. Not how to keep something so small and fragile alive. Night came quickly in the desert. As the moonlight filtered through warped wooden slats, Caleb sat against the wall, boots off, arms crossed, staring at the tiny shapes breathing unevenly beneath the blanket. The fireplace was cold, the air brittle, but something else had begun to warm the room. The fragile rhythm of survival. Sleep didn't come easy. It hadn't for years. But when it did, it was filled not with gunfire or sand, but with memory. Wallace's deep voice echoed from some long-forgotten place. Sometimes, son, to heal yourself, you have to take care of something smaller than you. Back then, Caleb hadn't understood. Now he was beginning to. At dawn, the sound of scratching against the old wood floor roused him. Shadow, standing, legs unsteady, but eyes sharp, had made his way to Caleb's side. He didn't bark, didn't beg, just sat, watching, claiming his place. Caleb took them to the nearest vet. A 30-mile drive through dust and time. He didn't explain much. He didn't have to. Martha, a silver-haired vet tech with a soft voice and sharper eyes, packed up milk replacer, antibiotics, and whispered as she handed them over. "If you're saving them, you better save yourself too." Back home, Caleb cleared space in the cabin. He gave up his bed, slept on the cold tile next to the pups. Every time one whimpered, he woke. When Luna cried, he laid a steady hand on her back and whispered. To her or himself, he didn't know. By day 3, Rusty was moving again. Luna could lift her head, and Shadow, ever vigilant, had taken to watching the door at night, alert and ready. One afternoon, while cleaning out his father's desk, Caleb found an old envelope hidden beneath a false drawer bottom. Inside was a faded photo. Wallace standing tall beside a jet-black German shepherd, its eyes startlingly familiar. Shadow's eyes, on the back written in neat slanted letters. Legacy doesn't always bark. Sometimes it just watches. There was also a letter, unfinished, in his father's hand. If you're reading this, I guess you came back. Don't try to understand everything about me. Just don't repeat it. Let the creatures you meet teach you how to be human again. Caleb held the photo. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the war. But something cracked open. Not like a wound, more like a breath. A breath he didn't know had been holding since the moment he returned. That night, under a blanket of stars, he sat outside with Shadow curled at his feet, and whispered, "You and I, we've both got ghosts, huh?" Shadow didn't move. Just lifted his head, alert, present, as if saying, "Then let's haunt them together." Under the dim yellow light of the garage, where dust clung to old toolboxes and worn-out tires, lay motionless like silent witnesses to time, Caleb Stone sat on the cold concrete floor, his back resting against a rough brick wall. The 3 small creatures, now named Bear, Sky, and Shadow, were curled up together on his old army blanket, their breathing soft as the first whispers of spring wind. The room echoed with their gentle breaths, blending with the uneven rhythm of Caleb's heartbeat, a heart that had once seemed frozen after years of war and the pain of losing his father. But tonight, he felt something he hadn't in a long time, a reason to keep going. Bear, the brown pup with eyes as calm as earth, was the first to lift his head when Caleb entered the room. Sky, with her soft white chest marking, trembled at every unfamiliar sound, carrying the weight of abandonment in her tiny frame. And Shadow, silent, watchful, and always positioning himself between Caleb and any approaching noise, was the very image of unwavering loyalty. Caleb had once saved lives in the middle of explosions and gunfire, had dragged comrades from the jaws of death, but never before had anyone, or anything, made him feel like he was the one who needed saving, the way these 3 pups did. The first few days weren't easy. They wouldn't eat. They coughed up old bones and dirt. Sky suffered from relentless diarrhea due to dehydration. Bear shivered with fever throughout the night. Only Shadow, frail but never wavering, kept trying to stand each time Caleb entered the room. And Caleb, a man who had once fired a rifle without blinking, sat there all night, whispering words no one had ever taught him. "It's okay, I'm here." He walked to the small town nearby, a place that once felt like home, buying cans of dog food, bottles of clean water, and toys with the last dollars in his account. Some part of him knew he was betting on hope, but he kept going. On the seventh night, as Caleb was replacing the garage's flickering light bulb, Sky crawled over to him, pressed her tiny nose against his hand, and looked up. That gentle, warm touch, a silent thank you from a creature once deemed unworthy of life, stirred something deep inside him. A few days later, Bear barked, a weak, uncertain bark, when a distant motorcycle rumbled by. Caleb smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. And then, as if following some invisible cue, Sky began exploring the room. But it was Shadow who surprised Caleb the most. The little black pup, thin but determined, began waiting by the bathroom door every time Caleb showered, never leaving his post. It wasn't just recovery, it was a beginning. Caleb repurposed part of the backyard, building a makeshift training area using old wood, frayed cables, and broken fences his father had left behind. Not because he wanted to train them as fighters, but because he believed that, like people, dogs needed purpose. And Shadow was different. When Caleb whistled, Shadow didn't flinch. When Caleb reached out, Shadow moved without hesitation. The look in his eyes was the look of a soldier, a teammate. One morning, with the sun barely peeking over the distant desert hills, Caleb sat on his wooden porch, sipping coffee. Bear lay at his feet. Sky rested her head on his lap, and Shadow, as always, sat by the edge of the porch, his gaze scanning the property like a silent sentinel. And then Caleb felt it, that strange sensation, a cold prickle at the back of his neck. An instinct only survivors of war understood. Someone's watching. Caleb set his coffee down, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Years of training kept his body calm, but his mind sharpened. He stood slowly, signaling to Shadow with a faint gesture. And without a sound, the black pup crept toward the shadows behind a wooden beam. In that moment, Caleb knew this wasn't just a coincidence. He hadn't found those dogs by chance, and maybe he wasn't the only one who knew they existed. But whatever lay ahead, Caleb Stone and the 3 fragile souls he had saved would no longer face it alone. The Arizona sky turned ashen gray as evening fell, the wind whispering through brittle tree branches that creaked like a silent warning. Caleb sat on the steps of the old wooden house, his eyes fixed on the patch of open land in the distance, where Shadow stood, focused like a born sentinel. Shadow wasn't an ordinary dog. Caleb was growing more certain of that. The black German Shepherd didn't just respond to basic commands like sit or lie down. He reacted to signals Caleb had never taught him. A slight lift of Caleb's hand or a subtle shift in his step was all it took for Shadow to understand. Silently moving into the shadows, pressing low to the ground, eyes locked in the direction Caleb was watching. One early morning, while cleaning out his father's old garage, Caleb discovered a small wooden box with a rusted lock. The carved symbol on the lid matched the emblem of the military 9 unit his father had once served in. Curious, Caleb used his knife to pry open the brittle lock. Inside was a stack of old files, filled with handwritten notes and black and white photographs. At the bottom of the box was a worn envelope with the words, 9 Unit Batch 72, for lead trainer only. Caleb carefully unfolded the envelope. The first photograph he saw was unmistakable. Shadow just a little younger, but with the same piercing gaze. The brief note beneath the photo made Caleb's blood run cold. Shadow Batch 72-4 disposed. Unstable? Disposed? Disposed? Caleb whispered, unease creeping over him like a cold fog. That evening, as Caleb stepped outside to feed the dogs, he sensed something was wrong. Shadow, who always kept watch near the fence, was gone. Shadow, Caleb called out, his voice tight with worry. The only reply was the howling wind. Then suddenly, a low growl rumbled in the distance. Caleb's pulse raced as he bolted toward the sound. In the dim twilight, Caleb saw Shadow standing tense before a shadowy figure, a man in a black coat clutching a glinting knife. Shadow's growl deepened, his fur bristling as his sharp eyes locked onto the intruder. "Back off!" Caleb barked. The man flinched, stumbling a few steps back before turning and bolting into the darkness. Without hesitation, Shadow sprang after him. Weaving through dry brush and brittle grass, Caleb gave chase, but the man had vanished into the night. Shadow returned moments later, his dark eyes still sharp and alert. But there was something else in them too. Something Caleb recognized instantly. Absolute trust. "Good boy," Caleb murmured, running a hand down Shadow's back. The dog pressed his head against Caleb's chest, letting out a soft whimper as if to say, "I'm not leaving you." The next morning, Caleb made a decision. He visited Sheriff Holt, a longtime friend of his father's. When Caleb presented the file and recounted what had happened the night before, Holt's face darkened. "Listen, Caleb," Holt said gravely. "The 9 program your father was part of, it wasn't as simple as training service dogs. There were rumors that they experimented with creating something more. Not just regular 9 units, but 4-legged soldiers. Dogs trained to fight and react like human combatants." Caleb sat silently, his mind racing through every uncanny instinct Shadow had shown. The precise reactions, the heightened senses, the fierce protective nature. Shadow hadn't come into his life by chance. "You need to be careful," Holt warned. "If Shadow really is one of those dogs, someone's going to want him back, no matter what it takes." Caleb clenched his fists. At his feet, Shadow lay quietly, his calm eyes watching Caleb like he understood everything. "You're not going anywhere," Caleb murmured, resting his hand on Shadow's head. "I promise." Caleb sat in his dimly lit living room, his father's old files spread out before him. The yellowed pages were filled with handwritten notes using terms he'd never encountered before. High-intensity response, independent attack tactics, instability risk. Among the names listed, one line stopped Caleb cold. Shadow, code 72-4, descendant of Havoc. Caleb murmured the name. Havoc. It was a legend in the military 9 world, the dog hailed as the unbeatable warrior, credited with saving dozens of soldiers during ambushes in the Middle East. His father had spoken of Havoc as a symbol of absolute loyalty and intelligence, but no one had ever mentioned a successor. They wanted to destroy these dogs. Why? Caleb wondered. The answer came sooner than he expected. That night, as Caleb was double-checking the locks before heading to bed, a strange noise echoed from the porch. He eased the door open and stepped outside. The cold wind bit at his face, carrying the acrid scent of exhaust fumes. A shadow flickered near the fence. Caleb instinctively reached for the pistol at his waist. "Who's there?" he barked. The figure spun around just long enough for Caleb to glimpse cold, sharp eyes before the man bolted. But in that fleeting moment, Caleb recognized something familiar. An embroidered wolf head insignia on the man's sleeve. It was the symbol of the secret 9 program Victor Maddox had warned him about. "Shadow!" Caleb called out. From the darkness, Shadow shot forward like an arrow, sprinting across the yard in pursuit. Caleb followed, his flashlight beam slicing through the brittle brush. He spotted Shadow just a few yards from the fleeing man, growling fiercely. The stranger staggered, pulled out a small handheld device, and pressed a button. A high-pitched screech rang out, sharp enough to make Caleb clap his hands over his ears. Shadow yelped in pain, crumpling to the ground, his legs trembling violently. Caleb shouted and rushed forward, but the man had already vanished into the night. "Shadow, it's okay. You're okay," Caleb murmured, kneeling to cradle the trembling dog. Shadow's breaths were quick and shallow, yet his eyes remained locked in the direction the intruder had escaped. In those eyes, Caleb saw not only pain but something else. Determination. Determination not to let Caleb be harmed. The next morning, Caleb took Shadow to the vet. The doctor carefully examined the black fur along Shadow's neck, frowning when he uncovered a faint scar just below the surface. "Looks like he once had something implanted, but it's been removed," the vet muttered. "I think they tried to use some kind of electromagnetic pulse device to knock him out. They wanted to take him," Caleb murmured. "Because Shadow is Havoc's descendant." The vet sighed, his expression grave. "Caleb, if that's true, they'll come back. And next time they won't just bring a device. Caleb's hand gently rested on Shadow's back. The dog lifted his head, eyes shining with unwavering trust. "We're not running," Caleb said quietly. "If they come, we'll be ready." Darkness enveloped the cabin as Caleb sat motionless on the porch steps, his gun resting within arm's reach. He'll be back. Caleb was certain of that. The ones after Shadow and the other two dogs wouldn't give up easily. When the clock struck 2 a.m., faint footsteps crunched near the fence. Caleb tensed, fingers tightening around the gun. Shadow, who had been lying quietly by his feet, lifted his head, sharp eyes gleaming in the dark. Caleb didn't give a command, but Shadow silently moved, blending into the shadows like a phantom. A faint snip echoed, the sound of wire cutters biting through the fence. Caleb crept along the porch, hiding behind a wooden post. In the dim moonlight, he spotted 3 figures slipping into the yard, the lead man clutching a silenced pistol. "Shadow," Caleb whispered, barely audible. As if understanding, Shadow circled wide, weaving through the darkness to approach from behind. Caleb held his breath, waiting. The lead intruder knelt at the front door, fiddling with the lock. Caleb raised his gun, finger hovering over the trigger. But before he could shout, a low, menacing growl rumbled from the shadows. "What was that?" one of the men stammered, glancing over his shoulder, but it was too late. Shadow sprang forward like lightning. His jaws clamped onto the second man's arm, yanking him to the ground. The third man drew a knife, but before he could strike, Caleb charged, driving the butt of his pistol into the man's shoulder and sending him sprawling. "Fall back! Fall back!" the remaining man shouted, stumbling toward the fence, but Shadow wasn't letting him escape. The black dog lunged, slamming the man onto the dry earth. The man writhed beneath Shadow's powerful frame, screaming in panic. When Caleb reached them, the man stammered breathlessly, "Don't, please! I was just following orders. Who sent you?" Caleb growled, gun leveled at the man's forehead. "Victor Maddox. He wants Shadow." "And the other two?" The man's face glistened with sweat. "Get out," Caleb said through clenched teeth. "And tell Maddox that if he comes back, I won't be so forgiving." The man bolted from the yard like a spooked deer. Caleb turned back to Shadow. The dog sat down, panting hard, yet his eyes still blazed with unwavering focus. "Good job, buddy," Caleb murmured, resting a hand on Shadow's head. But deep down, Caleb knew this was only the beginning. Men like Victor Maddox didn't give up easily. Caleb stared out at the darkened forest beyond, and knew the fiercest battle of his life was still to come. Caleb sat quietly in the small kitchen, the dim light from the hanging lamp casting a weary yet determined look on his face. On the table lay the envelope the man in the suit had left the day before. The cold printed words on the paper read, "Demand for return of property, code 724. "Property," Caleb muttered, his hand tightening. "Do they think Shadow is just some kind of object?" Shadow, curled up beneath his feet, lifted his head as if sensing his owner's frustration. Caleb reached down, gently running his hand through the dog's sleek black fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "No one's taking you. No one." That afternoon, Caleb led the 3 dogs to the open yard behind the house. He set up a few obstacles. Some stacked wooden crates and sheets of metal he'd found around his father's old ranch. "All right, Shadow. Focus." Shadow stood about 30 feet away, ears perked with sharp attention. Caleb raised 2 fingers and flicked his wrist slightly. Instantly, Shadow lowered his body and began weaving silently through the obstacles like a shadow in the night. As he neared the enemy, a stuffed dummy Caleb had propped up. Shadow lunged, clamping down on the dummy's arm and yanking hard, sending it toppling to the ground. "Good boy," Caleb murmured with a faint smile. He knew Shadow's skills far surpassed those of a typical service dog, but what mattered most was the unwavering loyalty in those sharp eyes. When night fell, Caleb double-checked the locks and placed his rifle by the bed. Shadow lay by the windowsill, eyes wide and alert. The first sound came at 2 a.m., a faint crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. Caleb's eyes shot open. Outside the window, a dim flashlight beam swept across the yard. This time, there weren't just 3 figures. There were 5. "Shadow," Caleb whispered, and the dog was already poised before Caleb could signal. The first man approached the back door, crouching to pick the lock. Caleb gripped his rifle tightly, but held his fire. He waited. Shadow shot out from the porch like an arrow. The man shouted as Shadow sank his teeth into his wrist, causing his gun to clatter to the ground. The second intruder drew a stun baton, swinging wildly at Shadow. But the dog darted back, then circled and lunged from another angle, sinking his jaws into the man's calf. Meanwhile, Caleb burst from the house, rifle aimed. "Back off!" he shouted. Two of the men flinched, turning to flee. But one remained. A tall man with a long scar down his cheek. He didn't move. Instead, he drew a handgun and leveled it at Caleb. "Hand over the dog," the scarred man growled coldly. "I don't want any more blood spilled." "Shadow's not going anywhere," Caleb snarled, finger tightening on the trigger. "Then you've chosen death." The man began to raise his gun. But before he could take aim, a sharp growl pierced the air. Shadow charged from the side, launching himself at the scarred man and slamming him to the ground. Caleb seized the moment, wrenching the gun from the man's grip and smashing its mechanism against the dirt. The scarred man staggered to his feet, glaring at Caleb with seething hatred. "You think you can protect him forever?" he spat. "Victor Maddox won't let this go. Let him try." Caleb shot back, his eyes locked on the retreating figure. The men vanished into the night, but Caleb knew this was far from over. Turning back, Caleb found Shadow sitting at his feet, his chest rising and falling in exhausted gasps. The dog's eyes still gleamed with fierce determination. Caleb knelt down, wrapping his arms around his loyal protector. "We'll get through this," he whispered. "I promise." The gray sky hung heavy over the small town as Caleb stepped out of the police station. In his hand was a copy of the investigation report, pages that laid bare the dark truth about the 9 program, and the man behind it, Connor Slate. Caleb stood on the steps, quietly surveying the still street before him. The truth was out, but he knew men like Victor Maddox didn't give up easily. That evening, Caleb kept his eyes on the black pickup truck that had been parked across the street for 2 hours. "He is still watching," Caleb muttered. Shadow, lying at his feet, let out a low growl, his sharp eyes locked on the truck. "It's all right, buddy," Caleb murmured, giving the dog's head a gentle pat. But deep down he knew nothing was all right. The next morning, as Caleb took the 3 dogs out back for training, the truck reappeared, this time closer, parked directly outside his gate. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with a tattoo of a snake coiled around a gun on his left wrist. "Victor sends his regards," the man said, his voice low and gravelly like stones scraping beneath a boot. "He wants what's his." "Shadow isn't his," Caleb replied, planting himself in front of the gate, his eyes locked on the stranger. "If you think a dog isn't worth spilling blood over, you're wrong," the man smirked, then turned back to his truck. "You'll be back, and next time I won't be alone." As the truck rumbled away, Caleb glanced at Shadow. "Time to get ready, buddy. About night." Caleb set up additional obstacles around the yard, creating a makeshift system of traps. He stretched fishing wire between tin cans, scattered nails along the main entrance, and rigged an old spotlight on the roof for visibility. Shadow followed closely, eyes fixed on Caleb's every move. Around midnight, the faint sound of rustling came from the gate. Caleb opened his eyes instantly, grabbing his rifle and signaling to Shadow. A man in a baseball cap crept over the fence and tripped the wire. The tin cans clattered loudly, shattering the silence. Caleb flipped on the spotlight, flooding the yard with harsh white light. 3 figures froze in place. "Back off!" Caleb shouted. "You think some lights and wires can stop us?" The man in the cap growled, pulling out a gun. But before he could aim, Shadow sprang from the shadows, slamming into the gunman and knocking him to the ground. The other 2 panicked and bolted. Caleb rushed forward, driving his boot down hard on the arm of the man groaning beneath him. "Talk! Who sent you?" "Victor," the man wheezed. "He wants Shadow, and you too." Caleb grabbed the man by his collar and shoved him toward the gate. "Go tell Maddox that if he tries this again, I won't hold back." The man stumbled away, limping into the dark. Caleb knelt beside Shadow, pulling the dog close and ruffling his sleek fur. "Good job," he whispered. "Now let's get inside. Our fight's just beginning." Caleb sat on the steps of his wooden cabin, eyes fixed on the distant forest ahead. The sun was sinking lower, painting the treetops in hues of fiery gold. Shadow lay at his feet, his muzzle resting on his front paws, eyes half closed, but ears still perked, ever watchful. "We're safe now, buddy," Caleb murmured, his fingers absent-mindedly running through Shadow's sleek black fur. "At least, for now." Yesterday, Caleb had received word from the sheriff that Victor Maddox had been arrested while attempting to flee the state. The evidence against the 9 program, against Connor Slate, it had been enough to unravel a criminal network that had operated in the shadows for years. Caleb should have felt relieved, yet something still weighed heavily on his chest. The following days passed quietly. One morning, Caleb received a letter from the family who had adopted Bear. They wrote about how Bear had become a source of immense comfort to their daughter after her mother's passing. The nightmares that had plagued the little girl began to fade. "Bear isn't just a dog," they wrote. "He's the light in our daughter's life." Caleb smiled, a rare smile since all the chaos had unfolded. He also received a letter from the retired veteran who had adopted Sky. The woman wrote about the remarkable bond they had formed, how Sky seemed to understand the wounds she carried. "I once believed I'd never find peace again," the veteran wrote, "but now Sky has brought that peace back to me." Caleb reached down and rubbed Shadow's head. "And what about you, buddy?" he chuckled softly. "I guess fate decided you were meant to stay with me." The next day, while Caleb was taking Shadow out to train as usual, Shadow suddenly froze on the trail. The fur along his spine bristled, and his gaze locked onto a small incline ahead. Caleb frowned, then whistled softly. Shadow bolted forward. When Caleb reached the spot, he stopped in his tracks. Footprints mixed with tire tracks were pressed into the soft mud. "Guess it's not over yet," Caleb muttered, clenching his fists tightly. That night, Caleb didn't sleep. He sat in his chair, rifle laid across his lap, eyes fixed on the front door. Shadow lay at his side, his body tense as a coiled spring. Around 2 a.m., the faint sound of metal scraping echoed from the gate. Caleb quietly rose to his feet, gripping the rifle firmly. Shadow was already up, muscles taut beneath his sleek coat. A shadowy figure flickered outside. Caleb held his breath, waiting. The door creaked as someone tried to slip their hand inside to unlatch the lock. Caleb flipped on the porch light. The sudden brightness startled the intruder, who staggered back. He turned to run, but Shadow shot out like lightning. Caleb was right behind him. The man swung a knife, but Shadow was faster. His jaws clamped down hard on the man's wrist, sending the blade clattering to the ground. "Don't move!" Caleb barked, his rifle aimed squarely at the intruder's chest. "Wait, wait!" The man raised his hands in panic. I was just hired to come here." "Who hired you?" Caleb demanded. "A guy named Jace. Jace Holloway," the man stammered. "He told me to come and take back his property," meaning Shadow. Caleb stood frozen for a moment. He'd thought this fight was over, but there was still someone lurking in the shadows. "Get out of here," Caleb growled, "and tell Jace that if he dares to come near this place again, I won't hold back." The man stumbled off into the night, clutching his injured wrist. Caleb turned back to Shadow. The dog sat beside him, chest heaving, eyes still sharp and bright like molten steel. "We'll get through this, buddy," Caleb murmured, placing a firm hand on Shadow's head. "No matter what comes our way." Caleb stood on the porch of his cabin, eyes fixed on the rising sun peeking over the treetops. At his feet, Shadow stirred, stretched with a long yawn, then nuzzled his head against Caleb's knee. Life seemed peaceful again, but Caleb knew better than anyone that peace could vanish in an instant. That morning, Caleb decided to drive into town. It had been a while since he'd visited the old cafe, the one where old Pete always kept a seat ready for him by the window. The moment Caleb stepped inside, he knew something wasn't right. The usually lively chatter was replaced by an eerie silence. A few patrons glanced at him, then quickly buried their faces in their coffee cups. "Caleb," Pete's gravelly voice called from behind the counter. "You better sit down." Caleb walked over and Pete slid the morning paper across the counter. The bold headline on the front page made his blood run cold. "Jace Holloway, state's most dangerous fugitive still at large. Someone spotted him near the North Trail," Pete muttered. "Close to your place." Caleb felt his grip tighten around the coffee cup. He forced himself to stay calm. "He'll handle it," he said quietly. That evening, Caleb made preparations. His rifle was loaded. The floodlights were fitted with fresh bulbs, and Shadow had been briefed with firm but gentle instructions. Caleb didn't know when Jace would strike, but he knew one thing for certain: Jace wouldn't stop. Close to midnight, Caleb heard a faint rustling from the back door. He shot upright, signaling to Shadow. The dog silently slunk to the floor, muscles tense like a coiled spring. Through the window, a shadow moved. Caleb gripped his rifle tightly, waiting for the intruder to step inside. Click. The back door creaked open. Caleb waited, still as stone. When Jace Holloway stepped fully into the kitchen, Caleb hit the switch. The floodlight blazed to life, catching Jace in its glare. "Don't move," Caleb barked. Jace froze, but his eyes gleamed cold and sharp like a wolf's. "You think a gun's gonna stop me?" he sneered. "I'm just here for what's mine," he sneered. "I'm just here for what's mine." "Shadow isn't yours," Caleb growled, stepping closer. "He's family," Jace smirked. Then in a flash drew a gleaming knife from his belt and lunged. The blade whistled through the air, streaking straight for Caleb. But before Jace could strike, Shadow shot out from the shadows. The dog's jaws clamped down hard on Jace's arm, teeth sinking deep into muscle. Jace roared in pain, flinging his arm wildly and sending Shadow tumbling across the floor. But before Jace could escape, Caleb lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. "You're not hurting anyone else," Caleb growled, driving his knee into Jace's back and pinning him to the floor. The police arrived minutes later. As they hauled Jace into the back of their cruiser, Caleb slumped onto the porch steps, his shoulders finally relaxing after days of tension. Shadow limped over and licked Caleb's hand, his tail wagging faintly, as if to say the fight was finally over. The next morning, Caleb sat in his familiar wooden chair on the porch, sipping steaming coffee. Warm golden sunlight spilled across the yard, bathing Shadow's sleek black fur as the dog lay curled contentedly at his feet. "We did it, buddy," Caleb murmured, his hand resting gently on Shadow's side. The dog let out a soft, contented sigh, as if both of them were finally shedding the weight they'd been carrying for so long. Maybe at last they had found their way home. Life at times feels much like Caleb and Shadow's journey, filled with challenges, losses, and moments when we are forced to stand up and face danger. Their story isn't just about courage or strength. It's about believing in new beginnings and the power of perseverance. In our current lives, many of us can see ourselves in Caleb, someone who has endured pain, loss, and even moments of complete hopelessness. When Caleb found the 3 abandoned puppies in the desert, he didn't just save them. He unknowingly saved himself. Caleb's life had been overshadowed by past traumas and the weight of loneliness, yet those seemingly helpless creatures reignited a spark within him. This reminds us that even when we feel as though we have nothing left to hold on to, there's always a chance to find something meaningful, a friend, a purpose, or simply a reason to keep moving forward. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Caleb and Shadow's story is the value of loyalty and perseverance. Caleb didn't back down when he knew Jace Holloway was still lurking in the shadows. He didn't surrender to fear. In real life, each of us faces our own Jace Holloway, a difficult challenge, a prolonged illness, or an emotional burden that refuses to fade. Yet just as Caleb stood firm to protect Shadow, we can also find strength within ourselves to protect what we cherish, or even to safeguard our own well-being. Finally, the bond between Caleb and Shadow is a testament to the power of connection. When Shadow leapt into danger to protect Caleb, it wasn't just instinct. It was proof of a relationship built on trust, love, and sacrifice. In today's world, true connections, with family, friends, or even strangers, can be the lifeline that pulls us back from the depths of despair. Caleb and Shadow's story reminds us that no matter how painful our past, or how daunting our present may seem, new beginnings are always possible. The key lies in having the courage to open our hearts, to embrace love, and to push through our fears. And sometimes, salvation doesn't come from grand gestures. It can be found in the quiet presence of a loyal companion, whether human or a four-legged friend whose silent love speaks louder than words. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next videos.